The afternoon sun hung low over Riverside Elementary School, casting long shadows across the playground where children laughed and played without a care in the world. It was Tuesday, October 15th, just before dismissal time, and the air carried that peculiar crispness that only autumn in the Northeast can deliver. 7-year-old Emma sat on the metal bench near the edge of the playground, watching her best friend Sarah navigate the monkey bars. Emma wasn't particularly athletic. She preferred the quiet comfort of observing rather than participating. But she loved this time of day, when the playground was alive with energy and possibility. Emma wore her favorite light purple jacket, the one with the embroidered butterflies on the sleeves, and her dark hair was pulled back in neat braids that her mother had carefully woven that morning. Her lunchbox sat beside her, empty, except for the remnants of a strawberry jam sandwich. She was mentally preparing herself for the final hour of classroom instruction before the final bell rang and dismissed her into her parents' waiting arms. The school zone sat on Maple Street, a relatively quiet residential area bordered by tree-lined sidewalks and old Victorian homes converted into offices and small businesses. The crossing guard, Mr., stood at his usual position near the corner, a weather-beaten man in his 60s with a belly that preceded him and a smile that could warm the coldest heart. He'd been working that crossing for 12 years, ever since he retired from the Postal Service. He took his job seriously, treating every child like they were his own grandchild. Emma noticed the silver sedan before anything else seemed unusual about it. It appeared at the end of Maple Street, moving faster than typical school zone traffic. Most cars crawled through this area. The 15 speed limit was strictly enforced, and parents were constantly vigilant. But this car didn't slow down. Emma's eyes tracked it with idle curiosity, nothing more. Children have an instinctive awareness of their surroundings, though they rarely understand what they're sensing. The vehicle continued accelerating, and that's when Emma felt her stomach tighten. Something was wrong. She didn't have the vocabulary to articulate it, but her 7-year-old instincts screamed danger. Mr. also seemed to notice, his posture stiffening as he raised his hand to halt a group of third graders about to cross. The crossing guard's face transformed from its usual friendliness into something urgent and alert. "Get back," Mr. shouted, his voice cutting through the playground noise like a knife. The children froze, confused by the unusual command. Emma stood up abruptly, her strawberry jam sandwich forgotten on the bench beside her. The silver sedan didn't brake. It didn't swerve. It simply barreled toward the corner with the determination of a missile. Mr. dove out of the way with surprising agility for a man his age, his body tumbling across the pavement. The car missed him by what seemed like inches. Emma would later recount it as not even a foot away to anyone who would listen. But the vehicle's true target was a blue bicycle locked to the rack near the corner. It belonged to a 5th grader who always rode it to school on nice days. The impact was devastating. The sedan struck the bicycle with such force that it seemed to explode, metal fragments and rubber scattering across the intersection like shrapnel. The sound was a combination of screeching tires, crunching metal, and the terrible silence that follows extreme violence. Emma's scream emerged unbidden from her throat. It wasn't a childish shriek or a cry of alarm. It was something deeper, something primal. She watched, her eyes locked on the vehicle, trying to understand what she was seeing. The driver's face was visible through the windshield. Emma didn't consciously register details at that moment. She was too overwhelmed by shock. But her 7-year-old brain, in its remarkable way, was recording everything. The man's angular features, his expression of grim determination mixed with something darker, anger perhaps, or recklessness. There was a scar above his left eye, a thin white line that stood out against his tanned skin. His shirt was red, with white lettering across the chest that she couldn't quite make out. And his eyes, they were cold, devoid of concern or regret. Then, in what seemed like the blink of an eye, the sedan accelerated again, its tires spinning for a moment before finding purchase on the asphalt. It rocketed around the corner and disappeared into the residential streets, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burnt rubber and the sound of 100 frightened children crying out in unison. The playground erupted into chaos. Children screamed and ran in all directions, some toward the incident, others toward the safety of the school building. Teachers who had been monitoring recess began running toward the corner, shouting instructions that no one heard over the general pandemonium. Emma remained frozen on her bench, her hands trembling, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her mind was simultaneously processing too much information and nothing at all. Within minutes, the first police car arrived, its sirens wailing through the once peaceful afternoon. Officers emerged, immediately securing the area and ushering children away from the corner. Mr., dusting himself off with shaking hands, approached a police officer and began describing what he'd witnessed. Other adults gathered, pointing down the street where the vehicle had disappeared, their voices rising and falling with urgency and fear. A police officer, Officer James, began moving through the crowd of children, his notebook in hand, gently asking questions. Did anyone see the driver? Did anyone notice the license plate? Which direction did the car go? Children pointed and talked over each other, their accounts confused and contradictory. Some said they'd seen a man, others insisted it was a woman. Some swore the car was silver, others were certain it was gray. The details fragmented and becoming less reliable with each retelling. Then officer spotted Emma sitting alone on the bench, her small body still trembling, her face pale. He approached her with gentleness in his voice. "Hi there, sweetheart. My name is Officer. I'm a police officer. Can you tell me what you saw?" Emma looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks. Her mouth opened, but the words came out in a jumbled rush, mixed with sobs and hiccups. He had a red shirt, and his face, he looked mean. There was a thing above his eye, like a scratch or something. He was so fast, Mr. almost got hit. He was so angry. Emma's words tumbled over each other. An officer wrote furiously, trying to capture her statements even as she contradicted herself, confused by the adrenaline coursing through her small body. Her teacher, Mrs. Martinez, came and wrapped a blanket around Emma's shoulders, speaking in low, soothing tones. But Emma couldn't calm down. The adrenaline that had flooded her system during those terrible seconds continued to surge through her body, making her shake violently. She'd witnessed something traumatic, something that shouldn't happen in a school zone where children were supposed to be safe. As more officers arrived and the incident scene was carefully documented, no one could have predicted the journey that 7-year-old Emma was about to undertake. She had seen the driver's face clearly, clearer than anyone else on the playground. She had details that would be crucial to finding the hit-and-run driver. But she was also traumatized, confused, and her young mind was already struggling to separate what she'd actually seen from what she'd imagined in those chaotic moments. The school called her parents immediately. Within 15 minutes, her mother arrived at the school, her face a mask of worry and fear. She held Emma close, asking the same questions over and over. "Are you hurt? Are you okay? Did you see what happened?" Emma clung to her mother, unable to stop shaking, unable to find the words to explain the horror she'd witnessed. That night, Emma didn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling, replaying the incident over and over in her mind. She could see the driver's face. She could hear the sound of the impact. And she could feel the weight of something she didn't yet understand, the realization that what she'd seen mattered, that the truth she held inside her small body might be the key to finding the man who'd left the scene without looking back. What Emma didn't know was that her trauma was only just beginning. What lay ahead would test her courage, shake her confidence, and force her to confront the question of whether anyone would ever truly believe her. 3 weeks had passed since the incident on Maple Street, and the silver sedan had vanished as completely as morning fog. Police had issued an APB, checked traffic cameras, and interviewed dozens of witnesses, but the driver remained a ghost. The investigation hit a wall almost immediately, and that's when Detective Thomas realized that the only truly reliable witness was a 7-year-old girl whose credibility was rapidly deteriorating with each passing day. Detective was a veteran with 23 years on the force. He had kind eyes and a patient demeanor that usually put people at ease, but his job required him to question everything and everyone. He'd scheduled a follow-up interview with Emma at the precinct, thinking a formal environment might help her recall additional details. Her parents accompanied her to the building on a gray November morning, holding her small hands as they walked through the hallway toward the interview room. The room itself was deliberately non-threatening, soft blue walls, a round table instead of an intimidating desk, and a box of tissues positioned strategically in the corner. But Emma sensed the weight of it all. She was a child, yes, but children are far more perceptive about adult anxiety than adults typically realize. She could feel her parents' nervousness, could sense Detective's doubt beneath his friendly smile. "Emma, I just want to ask you a few questions about what you saw that day," Detective began, his voice gentle. "Can you tell me about the driver's eye color again?" Emma's small fingers played with the edge of her dress. Brown, or maybe hazel, I'm not sure, he was far away." "Wrote this down. You said in your first interview that his eyes were dark brown. Are you changing your answer now?" I think they were brown, but the sun was in my eyes and I was scared," Emma stammered, her voice becoming smaller with each word. This was the beginning of the problem. Wasn't being intentionally cruel or dismissive, but he was asking the same questions repeatedly, looking for consistency. In Emma's traumatized mind, each repetition felt like an accusation. What she'd initially described with certainty now felt uncertain. Had the driver's shirt said something specific? She thought so, but now she wasn't sure. How tall was he? She had no reference point for height when she was terrified. What was the exact shade of the car? Silver. Light gray. In the shadowy corner where it had disappeared, was it even silver? Left the interview room and spoke with his sergeant in the hallway. "Her story's already unraveling," he said, not unkindly. "She's 7 years old, traumatized, and her memory is completely unreliable. Add in the trauma of being questioned repeatedly, and she's going to become even less credible." 2 weeks later, the prosecutor's office called with news. They'd identified a suspect. A man named Robert, age 42, with a prior record of hit-and-runs and reckless driving. His silver 2015 sedan matched the general description. They brought him in for questioning, and that's when things began to fall apart for Emma's credibility. Stefan's attorney was a shark. He had a reputation in the county for successfully defending the indefensible, and he took one look at the prosecution's case and saw opportunity. A 7-year-old witness with wavering testimony. It was a gift. Immediately filed for discovery and obtained all of Emma's statements. He highlighted every inconsistency, every change in detail, every moment where she'd contradicted herself. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney James Harrison, initially felt confident. They had the suspect, they had a witness, they had physical evidence from the scene. But when began his preliminary motions, Harrison felt the weight of reality settle on his shoulders. In the courtroom, with the full light of judicial scrutiny, Emma's testimony would be examined microscopically. "Your Honor," stated during a pretrial hearing, "the witness's account is riddled with contradictions. In her first statement, she described the driver's shirt as red with writing. In her second interview, she claimed the writing was white. In her third interview, she wasn't sure about the shirt at all. How can the court rely on the testimony of a witness who can't maintain basic consistency about what she witnessed?" Harrison tried to counter. "Your Honor, the witness is a traumatized child. Inconsistencies in trauma recall are well documented in psychological literature. The core elements of her identification remain consistent. She identified the driver. She described a scar above his eye. She provided details that matched the suspect's appearance." But even as Harrison made these arguments, doubt crept into his own mind. Would a jury be convinced? Or would they see exactly what wanted them to see? An unreliable child making accusations against a man based on fragmented, inconsistent memories. The case, which had seemed solid just days ago, now felt precarious. Meanwhile, Emma's world was collapsing. She stopped going to school 3 weeks after the incident. It started with stomach aches, real physical pain that would grip her gut each morning before she was supposed to board the school bus. Her mother kept her home, assuming the discomfort would pass. It didn't. Instead, Emma developed nightmares. She would wake at 3 in the morning screaming, her sheets soaked with sweat, her small body trembling with terror. In these nightmares, the silver sedan didn't stop at the corner. It came directly for her. She couldn't run, couldn't escape, could only watch as it approached with inexorable certainty. Her parents and David felt helpless. They'd consulted with the prosecutor's office, with the police, with Emma's pediatrician. Everyone offered sympathy but no solutions. One well-meaning officer suggested that Emma might be exaggerating her memories, or even creating false memories based on police suggestions. The words, intended to be explanatory, landed like accusations against their daughter. David, a quiet accountant by nature, found himself researching hit-and-run cases and witness testimony. He discovered that many cases fell apart because of exactly what was happening to his daughter: the trauma of being questioned, the subtle suggestions of interviewers, the natural inconsistencies that come with a child's developing memory. He wanted to scream at someone, anyone, but there was no one to blame. This was the system, and the system wasn't designed for traumatized children. Emma into herself. She stopped playing with her toys. She stopped reading her favorite books. She sat in the living room for hours, staring at nothing, her small face aged by worry and fear. When her mother tried to engage her, Emma would flinch at sudden movements or loud noises. She'd become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for danger. At night, she demanded that both parents sit with her until she fell asleep, and even then, she would reach out repeatedly to make sure they were still there. "Mommy, do you think I'm a liar?" she asked one evening, her voice barely a whisper. His heart shattered. "No, sweetheart, of course not. You told the truth about what you saw." But the policeman asked me the same questions lots of times, and I gave different answers. That's what liars do, right? Didn't know how to explain to her 7-year-old that the adult world was failing her, that the system designed to protect her was instead traumatizing her further. She simply held her daughter close and promised that everything would be okay, knowing in her heart that she might be making a promise she couldn't keep. At the prosecutor's office, James Harrison sat in his chair late one evening, reviewing the case file once more. The trial was scheduled for 6 weeks away. Robert remained in custody, awaiting trial. The physical evidence was circumstantial. The eyewitness testimony was, as had effectively argued, riddled with inconsistencies. Harrison knew that without Emma's testimony holding up under cross-examination, the case might collapse entirely. He thought about the little girl he'd met briefly during a witness preparation session. She'd been so small, so frightened, and so obviously traumatized. And yet, in that same moment, when discussing the scar above the driver's eye, her description had been vivid and precise. She'd drawn a picture of it, and Harrison had immediately recognized it as matching the scar on Robert's face. The core of her testimony was true. Harrison was certain of it, but truth, he was learning, wasn't always enough. In the American legal system, credibility mattered as much as facts. And right now, 7-year-old Emma's credibility was hanging by a thread, threatening to unravel completely under the skilled assault of a defense attorney who would stop at nothing to create reasonable doubt in the minds of 12 jurors. As Harrison locked up his office and drove home through the dark November night, he couldn't shake the feeling that justice itself was on trial, and that he might be losing. By early December, Emma had become a shadow of herself. At 7 years old, she carried the weight of a burden that no child should ever bear. Her second-grade teacher, Mrs. Martinez, had expressed concern to and David during a parent-teacher conference. "Emma's not participating in class. She sits alone at recess." "She's forgotten how to be a child," the teacher said gently, her own eyes reflecting sadness at the transformation she'd witnessed. Scheduled an appointment with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. The office was deliberately designed to be non-threatening, with soft carpeting, pastel walls, and a shelf lined with stuffed animals and toys. Yet even in this sanctuary, Emma sat rigid on the couch, her small legs not reaching the floor, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. Dr. Mitchell was a woman in her mid-50s with gray-streaked hair and the kind of gentle competence that came from decades of helping traumatized children. She spent the first session simply talking with Emma, not probing, not questioning, just being present. She showed Emma her collection of smooth stones, talked about how some people held onto rocks to ground themselves when they felt overwhelmed, and asked if Emma had anything that made her feel safe. Emma shook her head. She didn't have anything, not anymore. Over the course of 2 weeks, Dr. Mitchell met with Emma 3 times and spoke with her parents twice. In those conversations with and David, she laid out her assessment with careful precision. Emma is experiencing classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The repeated questioning has compounded her trauma rather than helping her process it. What she needs isn't more pressure or more interviews. She needs grounding. She needs something that provides unconditional acceptance and stability without judgment or demands. David leaned forward. "What do you recommend, doctor?" "I want to suggest something that might sound unconventional," Dr. Mitchell said. "Research has shown that emotional support animals can be tremendously beneficial for traumatized children, particularly those Emma's age. A dog, specifically a calm, well-trained dog, could provide Emma with a sense of safety and stability. It wouldn't be a cure, but it could be a foundation from which other healing could occur." His eyes widened. "You think Emma should have a dog?" "I think it's worth exploring," Dr. Mitchell said. "There's an organization about 40 minutes from here called Hearts of Courage. They train emotional support animals specifically for traumatized children. Would you be willing to visit and see if there's a match?" 2 weeks later, on a cold Saturday morning in mid-December, the family drove to Hearts of Courage, a sprawling facility set on 5 acres of land in a rural area outside the city. The main building was a converted barn painted a cheerful red, with fenced paddocks and open fields. A woman named Corinne Wright, the program director, greeted them warmly. She had the weathered look of someone who spent most of her time outdoors, and her smile was genuine. "Emma," Corinne knelt down to Emma's eye level, "I have several dogs here who might be a good match for you. Would you like to meet them?" Emma nodded mutely, her hand clutching her mother's coat. Corinne led them through the facility. They met Daisy, a black Labrador who was too energetic for Emma's current state. They met Chester, a calm beagle who was perhaps too small to provide the physical comfort Emma might need. And then Corinne said, "Let me show you Bailey." Bailey was housed in a spacious enclosure at the back of the facility. He was a golden retriever approximately 2 years old, with a coat the color of honey and an expression so peaceful it almost seemed transcendent. He approached the fence with measured steps, not rushing, not demanding attention, simply present. When he saw Emma, his tail began a slow, steady wag. Corinne opened the gate and Emma stepped through hesitantly. Bailey approached, sniffed Emma's hand gently, and then did something extraordinary. He laid his body down on the ground beside her, reducing his height, making himself non-threatening. His brown eyes were soft, intelligent, and utterly non-judgmental. Emma, who hadn't cried in weeks despite carrying an ocean of tears inside her, suddenly began to weep. She collapsed onto the ground beside Bailey, burying her face in his soft golden fur. Bailey didn't move. He simply lay there, his presence absolute and unconditional, as Emma's small body shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. Watched her daughter with tears streaming down her own face. David placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, and they stood in silent witness to something miraculous, Emma finally letting go of the burden she'd been carrying alone. Corinne spoke softly to the Bailey was rescued from an abusive home 2 years ago. His previous owner had been neglectful and cruel. When he arrived here, he was terrified, defensive, and had completely shut down emotionally. Through patient care and training, he's learned to trust again. What I've observed is that Bailey has an almost supernatural ability to understand when someone else is hurting. He seems to know instinctively how to provide comfort. How long would she need to work with him before she could take him home? David asked. Bailey is already trained for emotional support work, Karen explained. Emma could take him home today if you'd like, but I'd recommend a series of sessions where they bond together, where you learn how to work with him as a team. It's not just about the dog, it's about creating a connection, a partnership. Over the next 3 weeks, Emma and Bailey became inseparable. She visited the facility twice a week, spending time with Bailey, learning about his signals, understanding how to read his body language. Karen taught her that when Bailey lifted his head and looked at her, he was checking in, making sure she was okay. When he pressed his body against her leg, he was offering grounding, helping her feel more connected to the present moment. When he placed his head on her lap, he was asking her to be still, to breathe, to exist in that moment with him. Slowly, Emma began to change. The hypervigilance didn't disappear overnight, but it became more manageable. When Emma felt anxious, she would bury her fingers in Bailey's fur, and her nervous system would begin to calm. The nightmares still came, but now Emma would wake up to find her parents in her room, and Bailey would jump onto her bed, his warm body grounding her back into reality. On the 3rd week, after they had made the decision to formally adopt Bailey, prosecutor James Harrison called. The trial date had been moved up. It would begin in 3 weeks. They needed to conduct trial preparation sessions with Emma immediately. Stomach sank. "Can we bring her dog?" she asked. She has an emotional support animal now, and her psychologist recommends that he be present during stressful situations. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I suppose that would be acceptable," Harrison said cautiously, "as long as the dog isn't disruptive." The first trial preparation session took place on a cold January day in the prosecutor's office. Emma sat in a chair across from Harrison, with Bailey's head resting on her lap. She was still nervous. There was no magic cure, but something fundamental had shifted. When Harrison asked her to describe the driver's shirt, Emma closed her eyes, let her fingers sink into Bailey's soft fur, and spoke with clarity. He was wearing a red shirt. The writing was white. It looked like it might have said something, but I couldn't read it clearly because I was scared and far away. Harrison leaned forward. "Emma, that's more detailed than anything you've said before." "Bailey helps me think better," Emma said simply, her small hand stroking the dog's ears. "When I'm scared, I hold him and then I can remember." Harrison exchanged a glance with the paralegal in the room. They'd been searching for the key to unlock Emma's testimony, and it had come in the form of a gentle golden retriever with patient brown eyes and an almost supernatural ability to calm a traumatized child. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma and Bailey worked through the entire testimony together. With each session, Emma became more confident, more detailed, more credible. She could describe the driver's facial features, the location of the scar, the color of his eyes, the partial license plate number. All the details were there. They'd always been there. But Emma had been too traumatized to access them. Bailey hadn't changed what Emma had witnessed. He'd simply given her the emotional safety she needed to speak it. The night before trial, Emma sat with Bailey in the backyard of her home, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. She wrapped her arms around the dog's neck and whispered, "Tomorrow, we tell the truth, together." Bailey turned his head and gently licked Emma's face as if to say, "I'm with you. You're not alone." And for the first time since that terrible afternoon on Maple Street, Emma felt truly safe. 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, sat in his corner office on the 16th floor of a downtown high-rise, reviewing the prosecution's discovery materials. His office was exactly what one would expect from a defense attorney of his caliber: expensive mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and walls lined with diplomas and awards documenting his various victories. Was a man in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the kind of sharp, calculating eyes that made witnesses uncomfortable on the stand. He'd been examining the prosecution's recent witness preparation notes when he discovered something that made him smile. Attached to the file was a memo from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, recommending that Emma, emotional support animal, Bailey, a golden retriever, remain present during all trial-related activities to manage her anxiety and trauma responses. Read the memo 3 times, his smile growing wider with each pass. This was the opening he needed. He immediately picked up the phone and called his associate, Tors, into his office. "Look at this," he said, sliding the memo across his desk. "The prosecution is planning to bring an emotional support dog into the courtroom. An emotional support dog. Can you imagine what that will do to a jury? All that sympathy, all that emotional manipulation masquerading as therapeutic necessity." Read the memo carefully. "The case law on this is mixed," she said cautiously. "Some courts have allowed emotional support animals for child witnesses." "But not all," countered, "and certainly not when the animal's presence would create a prejudicial effect on the jury. That's our angle. We file a motion in to exclude the animal. We frame it as protecting the defendant's right to a fair trial, as preventing the prosecution from exploiting the jury's emotions. It's textbook strategy." By Friday of that same week, had filed his motion with the court. The document was meticulously crafted, 23 pages of legal argument and case citations. The core of his argument was elegantly simple. Allowing an emotional support animal into the courtroom would unfairly prejudice the jury toward the child witness by appealing to emotion rather than reason. The jury would be tempted to believe the child's testimony not because it was credible, but because they would sympathize with the frightened little girl and her comforting dog. "Presence of an animal," wrote, "transforms the courtroom from a forum of justice into a theater of emotional manipulation. The defendant's right to a fair trial is fundamentally compromised when the prosecution is permitted to present its evidence in a manner specifically designed to trigger emotional rather than rational responses. Furthermore, there is substantial case law suggesting that animals in the courtroom constitute grounds for mistrial, as they unduly influence jury deliberation." The prosecution received a copy of the motion on Monday morning. James Harrison read it in his office, his jaw tightening with each page. He understood what was doing. It was a legitimate legal strategy, but it was also a direct attack on the one tool that had transformed Emma from a confused, traumatized child into a coherent witness. Harrison immediately scheduled a meeting with Dr. Mitchell and Emma's parents. They met in a conference room at the courthouse, a utilitarian space with beige walls and a long table. Dr. Mitchell was calm but firm. "The science is clear," she explained, pulling out research papers and studies. "Emotional support animals have been shown to significantly reduce cortisol levels, stress hormones, in traumatized individuals. They improve cognitive function, enhance memory recall, and provide grounding that helps children access their true memories rather than trauma responses. Excluding Bailey wouldn't just be emotionally harmful to Emma, it could actually compromise the reliability of her testimony." "What if the judge rules in the defendant's favor?" asked, her voice trembling. "What happens to Emma?" "Then we have serious problems," Harrison admitted. "The prosecution's case largely depends on Emma's testimony. Without her credibility intact, without her clarity, we might not get a conviction. And Emma might suffer significant." David slammed his hand on the table. "This is insane. We found something that helps our daughter process this trauma, and now they want to take it away. On what legal grounds?" "On the grounds that it might prejudice the jury," Harrison explained. "It's not an unreasonable argument, legally speaking. We need to prepare a counter-motion, and we need to do it carefully." Over the next week, Harrison worked with Dr. Mitchell to craft their response. They gathered peer-reviewed research on emotional support animals. They cited case law supporting accommodations for child witnesses. They prepared expert testimony from Dr. Mitchell, explaining the specific psychological mechanisms by which Bailey assisted Emma's testimony. The defendant's argument, Harrison wrote in his countermotion, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of emotional support animals. Bailey does not provide false memories or embellish testimony. Rather, he provides the emotional regulation necessary for a traumatized child to access her actual memories. The distinction is critical. Excluding Bailey would not level the playing field. It would cripple the prosecution's primary witness, while simultaneously a child who has already suffered grievously. The motion's hearing was scheduled for the Friday before trial. The courtroom was packed with spectators. The case had attracted media attention, and reporters filled several rows. Emma was not present. The judge had ruled that this portion of the hearing did not require her testimony. Judge entered from her chambers, a woman in her late 60s with the kind of composed demeanor that came from decades on the bench. She'd been a judge for 18 years and had presided over hundreds of cases involving child witnesses. She listened carefully as presented his oral argument. "Your Honor, the fundamental principle of a fair trial is that evidence is judged on its merits, not on its emotional impact," argued eloquently. The presence of an emotional support animal in the courtroom transforms this trial into something beyond the rational evaluation of evidence. The jury will see a frightened child with a comforting dog, and they will be inclined to believe whatever that child says, not because the testimony is credible, but because emotion overrides reason. He paused, letting the words settle. "Furthermore, Your Honor, my client's Sixth Amendment rights are at stake. He has the right to confront his accuser in a manner that allows for rigorous cross-examination. That right is compromised when the accuser is accompanied by an animal specifically chosen to create sympathy." When it was Harrison's turn, he approached the bench with the research papers in his hands. "Your Honor, the defendant characterizes an emotional support animal as a manipulation tactic, but the research is unambiguous. Bailey does not enhance Emma's testimony. He enables her to access her true memories. Without him, Emma becomes the traumatized, incoherent child that the defendant's attorney has successfully portrayed in the media. With Bailey, Emma becomes what she actually is, a credible witness to a serious crime." He placed the research on the judge's bench. "This isn't about emotion, Your Honor. This is about accommodating a child's medical and psychological needs so that she can provide her best testimony. Courts across the country have recognized that emotional support animals serve this function without prejudicing juries." Judge spent the weekend reviewing the materials. She read the research papers, studied the case law, and consulted with her clerk about precedent. On Monday morning, she issued her ruling. "The court finds," she began, reading from her written decision, "that emotional support animals have a documented therapeutic function in assisting traumatized individuals in accessing accurate memories and managing anxiety responses. Furthermore, research indicates that the presence of such animals does not compromise the reliability of testimony, but rather enhances it by enabling the witness to function at her optimal cognitive level." His face darkened as the judge continued. However, the court also recognizes the defendant's concern regarding the potential for jury prejudice. Therefore, this court rules that the emotional support animal, Bailey, may remain present in the courtroom during the child witness's testimony, but he must be positioned in the gallery behind the prosecution's table, at a distance that allows for visual connection but not physical contact during testimony. The jury will be instructed at the beginning of trial that the animal's presence is a medical accommodation and not evidence of any kind. Stood immediately. "Your Honor, I respectfully object to this ruling. The presence of the animal, regardless of its positioning, will influence jury deliberation." "Objection noted," Judge said coolly. "But the ruling stands. The emotional support animal may be present." As the hearing concluded and people filed out of the courtroom, Harrison felt the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. It wasn't a total victory, still had his opening to argue that Bailey's presence was prejudicial, but it was a victory nonetheless. Emma would have Bailey by her side. That evening, Harrison called the family with the news, wept with relief. Emma, upon hearing that Bailey would be there in the courtroom, seemed to stand a little taller. In his office, studied the judge's written ruling, looking for any angle he might have missed. He'd lost this battle, but the war was far from over. He had plans for cross-examination that would shake Emma's testimony to its core, and he doubted that a dog, no matter how well trained, could protect her from his assault on her credibility. As the week before trial unfolded, both sides made their final preparations. The prosecution worked with Emma and Bailey, rehearsing testimony, preparing her for the cross-examination that would come. The defense honed their strategy, identifying the inconsistencies in Emma's prior statements, preparing to paint her as a confused child whose memory had been unreliable from the start. Everyone understood that the trial would be decided not on legal maneuvering, but on what happened when Emma sat in that witness stand, with Bailey watching from the gallery, and faced the full force of calculated assault on her credibility. The stage was set. The battle for truth was about to begin. The morning of November 15th dawned cold and gray, with low clouds hanging over the city like a threat. Emma woke at 5 o'clock, her small body rigid with anxiety. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind replaying the testimony over and over, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. Bailey had remained pressed against her side all night, as if sensing the magnitude of what lay ahead. Had laid out Emma's outfit carefully, a simple lavender dress with long sleeves, modest and age-appropriate, the kind of clothing that would appeal to jurors' protective instincts without seeming manipulated. Emma's dark hair was brushed and braided, and had helped her bathe and prepare with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for special occasions. This was special. It was possibly the most important day of Emma's young life. The courthouse was imposing, a stone structure built in the 1920s with high ceilings and an air of solemnity. The trial had attracted media attention, and reporters crowded the courthouse steps, microphones in hand, trying to catch comments from anyone involved in the case. David had coached Emma on how to ignore them, how to focus on walking straight ahead without looking left or right. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The gallery was nearly full, spectators, journalists, and concerned citizens who had followed the case in the news. James Harrison sat at the prosecution table, his legal pads arranged meticulously, his expression carefully neutral. At the defense table, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, chatted casually with his associate as if he didn't have a care in the world. But his eyes were sharp, calculating, waiting. Judge entered and everyone stood. "The state versus Robert," she announced. "Let's bring in the jury." 12 jurors filed in, a cross-section of the community. Their faces were expectant, some sympathetic, others skeptical. They had no idea yet about Bailey, no idea about the emotional support dog sitting outside in the hallway with his parents. The judge had ruled that Bailey would only be brought in once Emma was on the stand. The bailiff called Emma. Emma's small hand trembled as she walked to the witness stand. She wore a necklace that her grandmother had given her, a small silver pendant in the shape of a butterfly. It was their signal. When Emma touched that necklace a certain way, her mother would know she was struggling. And when her mother touched her own necklace in the same way, Emma would know her support system was activated. As Emma was sworn in, her hand on the Bible, she looked toward the gallery. Her parents were there, with Bailey's leash in her mother's hands. The golden retriever sat calmly beside, his brown eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that transcended species. Even the judge glanced at the dog with evident surprise. No one had mentioned that he was so impressive, so clearly intelligent and well-trained. James Harrison approached the stand with a warm, reassuring smile. "Emma, can you tell me what you saw on the afternoon of October 15th? Emma began to speak, and her voice was steady. With Bailey watching, with her parents visible in the gallery, she recounted the incident with remarkable clarity. She described the silver sedan, the way it approached at high speed, the sound of the impact, the driver's face. As she spoke, she grew more confident. Her details became sharper. He had a scar above his left eyebrow. It was white and thin, like someone had cut him there. She described his red shirt and the white lettering she thought she saw. She provided the partial license plate number. The jury leaned forward, engaged and sympathetic. An elderly woman in the front row dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Then stood, "Thank you, Your Honor. I have a few questions for the witness." His voice changed everything. Gone was the warm, supportive tone of the prosecutor. His voice was sharp, edged with skepticism. He approached the witness stand with a predatory grace that made several jurors shift uncomfortably. "Emma, isn't it true that you've told different versions of this story?" "No," Emma said, but her voice wavered slightly. "Isn't it true that in your first police interview you said the driver's shirt was red with writing? But in your second interview, you were unsure about the writing." I wasn't sure if I could really see the writing," Emma stammered. "So you were wrong in one of your accounts, correct?" "Not wrong, just not remembering clearly." Smiled thinly. "But that is what wrong means, doesn't it, when you say something that isn't accurate?" Emma's breathing began to accelerate. Her hands, which had been folded in her lap, started to fidget. She glanced toward her parents. Her mother was watching intently, and Emma could see the tension in her shoulders. "You said the driver's eyes were dark brown, didn't you?" continued, his questions coming rapid fire. "But then you said they might be hazel. Which is it?" Brown, I think brown." "You think or you know?" Emma's chin trembled. Sweat began to bead on her forehead. She was 7 years old, facing down a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of making witnesses doubt themselves. He was very, very good at his job. Saw her breaking. He moved in for what he believed would be the kill. "Isn't it true that you've been working with a dog, an emotional support animal, and that this dog has made you believe things you're not sure about? Isn't it possible that your memories have been contaminated by suggestion?" Emma felt the panic rising in her chest. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The courtroom seemed to spin slightly. She looked toward the gallery, desperation in her eyes. Her mother saw the exact moment of Emma's unraveling. Without hesitation, without thinking about what it might look like, she reached up and touched her necklace, their signal, in the specific pattern they had practiced countless times. Her hand rose to her throat, fingers tracing the outline of the butterfly pendant in a deliberate, unmistakable gesture. Bailey's reaction was immediate and profound. His ears, which had been relaxed, suddenly perked up. His entire body became alert. And then, from deep within him, he released a single, soft but clearly audible whine, a sound that resonated through the courtroom like a bell rung at a funeral, a call to attention, a statement of presence and loyalty. The courtroom fell silent. Every eye turned toward the gallery. Every juror's attention shifted, if only for a moment, from Emma's distress to that remarkable sound and the dog who had made it. Emma felt the sound wash over her like a wave. It grounded her, anchored her back to reality. She took a breath, then another. Her small shoulders straightened slightly. The trembling in her hands stilled. Sensing something had shifted, tried to continue his assault. "Isn't it true that?" But Emma interrupted him, her voice stronger now. "No, I told the truth. I saw his face. I saw the scar. I remember what I saw." "Yet you've been inconsistent." "I was scared," Emma said, her eyes meeting directly for the first time. "I'm still scared, but I'm not wrong about what I saw. The man in the red shirt had a scar over his eye. You can look at him, he's right there." Emma pointed directly at Robert sitting at the defense table. The courtroom rippled with tension. His face flushed with anger, and the judge gavelled once sharply to maintain order. Tried several more questions, but Emma had found her footing. With Bailey's presence firmly established in her mind, with that single whine resonating through her nervous system, she maintained her composure. She didn't waver again. Her answers were clear, direct, and consistent. By the time finished his cross-examination 20 minutes later, he'd failed to shake her core testimony. The scar, the red shirt, the vehicle's description, these details remained constant. As Emma stepped down from the witness stand, she made brief eye contact with Bailey. The dog's tail wagged once, slowly, deliberately. It was a gesture that said, "You did it. I'm proud of you." The judge called a recess, and Emma was rushed back to the secure waiting room where her family embraced her. She was shaking, exhausted, but also somehow transformed. She had faced her fear, had stared down a skilled attorney, and had emerged not just intact but victorious. In the courtroom hallway stood talking with his assistant, his face unreadable. But internally he knew the truth. He'd had his chance to destroy the child's testimony, and he'd failed. That single whine from the dog, that small gesture from the mother, had given Emma exactly what she needed to find her courage. The battle was far from over, but the defining moment had arrived. The afternoon session began with tension crackling through the courtroom like electricity. Judge entered, and everyone rose. Emma was brought back to the witness stand, still under oath, with Bailey visible in the gallery but at a distance, his presence maintained by steady hand on his leash. Wasted no time. As soon as Emma was settled, he stood with a triumphant expression that made several jurors exchange uncertain glances. He'd realized something during the recess that he believed would turn the tide back in his favor. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the incident that occurred just before the witness's testimony concluded," began, addressing the judge rather than Emma. The witness became visibly distressed during cross-examination. At that precise moment, a signal was made by someone in the gallery. A specific hand gestured to the necklace worn by an individual who we now know is the witness's mother. Immediately following that signal, the emotional support dog produced an audible response. "Your Honor, this was not a spontaneous gesture of animal emotion. This was orchestration. This was a coordinated attempt to manipulate the witness's response and, by extension, to manipulate this jury." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Several jurors leaned back in their chairs, their expressions shifting from sympathy to skepticism. Judge gavelled sharply to restore order. James Harrison stood immediately. "Your Honor, I object to this characterization and request the opportunity to address the jury regarding what actually occurred." "Permission granted," Judge said carefully. "Approach the bench, both of you." The attorneys and judge huddled, their voices low. From his position at the witness stand, Emma could see their mouths moving but couldn't hear the conversation. Her mother, sitting behind the prosecution table, reached out and gently squeezed Emma's father's hand, both of them acutely aware of how precarious the situation had become. After several minutes of discussion, the judge returned to the bench. "The jury will hear argument from both sides regarding the dog's response and its implications. Mr. Harrison, you may begin." James Harrison had been a prosecutor for 16 years, and he'd learned that sometimes the best defense was a clear, rational explanation of the truth. He approached the jury box with calm certainty, making sure to establish eye contact with each juror in turn. "Ladies and of the jury, I want to talk about what you actually witnessed today," he began. "The defense counsel wants you to believe that this was orchestrated, that we coordinated a signal to manipulate a dog's behavior to influence your sympathies. Let's think logically about that for a moment." He paused, letting the silence emphasize his point. "First, if we were going to orchestrate something like that, would we do it so obviously? Would we allow it to happen in front of everyone in this courtroom, in front of the judge, in front of you? Or would we keep it hidden? The fact that it happened openly, visible to everyone, suggests it wasn't orchestration. It was genuine emotion responding to genuine need." Harrison began to pace slowly in front of the jury box. "Second, let's think about what actually happened. Emma was becoming distressed during cross-examination, that's not disputed. Her mother, seeing her child in emotional distress, provided comfort. That's not manipulation. That's parenting. That's a mother responding to her daughter's pain. He pointed gently toward Emma. Now, regarding the dog's response, the defense wants to suggest that this was a cued behavior, that Bailey was trained to whine on command as part of some grand scheme. But consider the facts. Bailey is an emotional support animal. He's trained to recognize when his handler, in this case Emma, is experiencing emotional distress. The dog's response wasn't to a signal from the mother. The dog's response was to genuine emotional distress in a child he's been trained to comfort. Harrison held up his hands. In fact, I'll be direct. Yes, Emma's mother did signal to her daughter, but that signal wasn't to the dog. That signal was a gesture of support from a mother to a child. It said, "You're not alone, I'm here. You can do this." The dog observed Emma's emotional state changing as a result of that maternal support, and the dog responded by doing what he's been trained to do: acknowledge the emotional state and provide comfort. He turned back to the defense table, his expression serious. The defense counsel characterizes this as manipulation, but what we're actually looking at is a child, traumatized by witnessing a hit-and-run accident, receiving support from her family and her emotional support animal so that she can access her actual memories and tell the truth. If that's manipulation, then every parent who holds their child's hand in a doctor's office is guilty of manipulation. Harrison returned to his position. More importantly, I want to point out what the defense counsel has not argued. He has not suggested that Bailey somehow made Emma's testimony less accurate. He hasn't argued that the dog caused her to lie or to confabulate. He hasn't claimed that the dog changed her memories. All he's done is suggest that the dog's presence created sympathy. And yes, the jury may feel sympathy for a frightened child. That's human. That's natural. But sympathy is not the basis for a guilty verdict. Truth is. He picked up the research papers that had been entered into evidence during the pretrial motions. The evidence presented to this court shows definitively that emotional support animals enhance the accuracy of trauma witnesses' testimony. They do not contaminate it. They do not create false memories. They help witnesses access their true memories. And that's exactly what we see here. Stood to make his rebuttal, but Harrison had achieved his goal. Several jurors were nodding slowly, reconsidering their momentary doubt. The elderly woman who had cried earlier during Emma's direct testimony was looking directly at Emma with renewed sympathy and something else: understanding. "Your Honor," began, his voice less confident than before, "the prosecution would have this jury believe that the dog is merely responding to legitimate emotional support. But the timing is too convenient. The signal is too clear. This was designed to influence the witness and, by extension, this jury." But even as spoke, he could see that the jury wasn't fully with him. The jurors who had seemed ready to doubt Emma during the recess were settling back into more receptive postures. Judge turned to Emma. "The witness may continue her testimony. Mister, do you have additional questions?" Hesitated. He'd already damaged Emma's credibility as much as he could. Continuing to press might actually backfire, might make the jury see him as bullying a frightened child. He exchanged a glance with his client, Robert, whose face had grown darker with each passing minute. "Just a few more questions," said, his voice carefully modulated to sound less aggressive. But Emma, feeling the renewed strength of Bailey's presence in the gallery, was ready for him. "Isn't it true that you changed some details of your story?" asked, returning to his earlier line of questioning. "No," Emma said firmly. "The details I remember clearly haven't changed. I saw the scar. I saw the red shirt. I saw his face. The things I wasn't sure about, like whether the car was silver or gray or what the writing said on the shirt, those were never clear memories. But the things that matter are still the same." Tried another angle. "How can we know that your memories are accurate, that you're not confusing details from different people you've seen?" Emma paused and her hand moved instinctively to Bailey's direction in the gallery. She took a breath. "Because I remember being scared. I remember the sound of the crash. I remember his eyes looking at me, and I remember being afraid he'd hurt someone else. I remember Mr. almost getting hit. Those feelings don't get confused. They stay with you." The jury shifted again. Several members were now watching Emma with the kind of attention usually reserved for someone delivering profound truth. Then Emma did something unexpected. She turned to look directly at the jury. The man who hit the bicycle was wearing a red shirt. He had a scar above his left eyebrow. I will never forget his face because I was so scared when I saw it. I know what I saw. I'm telling the truth. Her voice didn't waver. Her eyes were clear and direct. And most importantly, there was no trace of the confusion or inconsistency that had plagued her earlier accounts. Realized he was losing more ground with each question. He made a final attempt. "Is it true that you had a dog during your trial preparation?" "Yes, Bailey helped me remember," Emma said simply. "He didn't make me say things that aren't true. He just helped me not be so scared that I couldn't think clearly." "So the dog helped you remember what you had already seen?" "Yes, he helped me remember the truth." Sat down. There was nothing more he could do. Emma had answered his question in a way that actually reinforced the prosecution's position. Bailey hadn't changed her memories, he'd helped her access them. As Emma was finally allowed to step down from the witness stand, the energy in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. The jury no longer looked skeptical. They looked convinced. They'd heard a frightened child do something remarkable, overcome her trauma, stand firm in her testimony, and deliver truth with a clarity that transcended age. Bailey's tail wagged slowly as Emma passed the gallery, and their eyes met for just a moment. It was enough. Emma had done what she needed to do. She had been brave. In the days that followed, as the prosecution presented its remaining evidence and the defense mounted its closing arguments, everyone in the courtroom understood one central fact. Emma's testimony, delivered with Bailey's support, had become the cornerstone of the case. And the jury had heard her, had believed her, had understood that sometimes the most powerful truth comes from the most unlikely sources. A 7-year-old girl and a golden retriever who'd learned together how to transform fear into courage. The jury retired to deliberate at 2:47 p.m. on a cold November afternoon. The courtroom erupted into motion. Spectators stood and stretched. Attorneys gathered their papers, and the energy that had been carefully contained throughout the trial suddenly released like a pressure valve opening. Emma was taken to a secure waiting area with her parents and Bailey, where she collapsed onto a bench, utterly exhausted by the emotional weight of the preceding hours. "You were so brave," whispered, her arms wrapped around her daughter. "I'm so proud of you." Emma said nothing. She simply leaned into her mother's embrace and buried her face in Bailey's soft fur, which had become her safe place, her refuge from the chaos of the adult world. In the jury room, 12 ordinary people faced an extraordinary responsibility. The foreman, a retired schoolteacher named no relation to Emma, called for an initial vote. "Let's start with a show of hands. How many believe the defendant is guilty of hit and run?" 10 hands rose immediately. The 2 remaining jurors exchanged glances with evident uncertainty. "Let's talk through this," suggested, her teacher's instinct kicking in. "What are the concerns?" One of the uncertain jurors, a man in his 60s named Robert, cleared his throat. "The witness was a kid. Kids make mistakes. Her story changed. I'm not convinced." Nodded carefully. "Let's look at what actually changed," she said, pulling out the trial transcript. "When did her core identification change?" They reviewed the testimony methodically. The scar above the eye consistent across all accounts. The red shirt consistent. The vehicle description essentially consistent with only minor variations about shade. But her uncertainty about peripheral details, about things that didn't matter to the identification, remained unchanged. As they examined the testimony closely, the picture became clearer. Another juror, a woman who'd been skeptical throughout much of the trial, spoke up. And remember what that prosecutor said. The emotional support dog didn't change her memories. He helped her access the real ones. That makes sense to me. My own daughter gets nervous about things she knows perfectly well. She just needs to be calm to remember. Robert remained unconvinced, but as the discussion continued, the logic became undeniable. There was physical evidence linking S's vehicle to the scene. There was no evidence contradicting Emma's identification. And Emma's testimony, under the most brutal cross-examination, had ultimately been more credible and consistent than the defense had managed to prove it wasn't. At 5:15 p.m., after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury sent a message to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Media representatives rushed to their seats. Emma was brought back, flanked by her parents with Bailey positioned in the gallery. The defendant, Robert, sat at the defense table with beside him. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, as if he already sensed what was coming. Judge entered and everyone rose. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman answered, handing an envelope to the bailiff. The bailiff handed it to the judge, who opened it slowly, her expression remaining carefully neutral as she read the document. She handed it back to the bailiff to read aloud. The bailiff opened his mouth. "In the matter of the state versus Robert on the charge of leaving the scene of an accident, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The word hung in the courtroom like a bell that would never stop ringing. Emma felt her body go rigid, then limp. Her mother gripped her hand. Her father closed his eyes and silently mouthed a prayer of gratitude. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notepads. Several spectators applauded before the judge gavelled for order. At the defense table, leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of professional composure, but even he couldn't hide the tightness around his eyes. His face flushed with rage. "This is bullshit," he shouted, standing abruptly. "That kid lied." "Sit down, mister," Judge commanded coolly. "You're only making things worse for yourself." As deputies moved to restrain the defendant, Judge looked directly at Emma. "Young lady, please approach the bench." Emma's parents exchanged a glance of uncertainty, but gently nudged their daughter forward. Emma stood on shaky legs and walked toward the judge, her small frame appearing impossibly tiny against the imposing furniture of the court. Judge leaned down slightly, her expression warm and genuine. "Emma, I want you to know that what you did today took remarkable courage. You witnessed something terrible. You were frightened. You were questioned and challenged by people trained in the art of making witnesses doubt themselves, and you stood firm in your truth." Emma's eyes were wide, processing the judge's words. Continued, her voice carrying through the now silent courtroom. "I have presided over hundreds of cases in my 20 years as a judge. I have seen witnesses of all ages and all circumstances, but I have rarely witnessed the kind of bravery and honesty that you demonstrated today. You reminded this court and this jury why justice matters. You reminded us all that truth has power, even when it comes from someone as small as you." The judge paused, her eyes glistening slightly. "When you go home tonight, I want you to know that you have done something that will matter. You have spoken for someone, mister, who was almost hit, and for this entire community. You have shown that crimes have consequences, and you have shown that children's voices matter." She reached out and gently touched Emma's shoulder. "I'm very proud of you." Emma felt tears streaming down her face. She nodded, unable to speak, and returned to her mother's arms, held her daughter close, her own shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The media frenzy that followed was overwhelming. As the family exited the courthouse, photographers captured the image that would appear in newspapers and on news broadcasts across the state. A 7-year-old girl, her face streaked with tears, her small hand buried in the golden fur of an emotional support dog, standing beside her proud parents outside the courthouse where justice had been served. That evening, the local news led with the story. 7-year-old witness's remarkable testimony leads to conviction in hit and run case. The coverage highlighted not just Emma's bravery, but the role of Bailey, the emotional support dog who had become a symbol of how compassion and science could work together to serve justice. In the following days, Emma granted a single interview to a trusted reporter from the local newspaper. She sat with Bailey beside her, her small form appearing less fragile now, somehow strengthened by having spoken her truth. "How do you feel about the verdict?" the reporter asked gently. Emma took a moment before answering. "I feel like I told the truth and people believed me. That feels good." "Do you think Bailey helped?" Emma looked down at the dog, who gazed back at her with those intelligent, loving eyes. "Bailey didn't make me brave. He just reminded me that I wasn't alone. When I was scared, I could hold him, and that helped me remember that I had people who believed in me. And when I remembered that, I could be brave." At the courthouse, copies of the verdict began circulating among legal professionals. James Harrison forwarded it to child advocacy organizations across the state. Within weeks, the case had become a reference point in discussions about witness accommodation and trauma-informed justice practices. In his chambers, Judge filed a commendation in Emma's record. She also began drafting a proposal for a new state law that would formally recognize emotional support animals as legitimate accommodations in child witness cases. What had started as a controversial decision to allow Bailey in the courtroom had become the foundation for systemic change. That night, as Emma lay in bed with Bailey curled up beside her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. The nightmares would take longer to fully dissipate. The trauma of witnessing the accident would remain part of her story. But the trial was over. Justice had been served, and she had been believed. Her mother came in to check on her one final time before sleep. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" asked softly. "Yes, Mommy," Emma whispered. "I'm okay. Bailey helped me be brave, but now I think the brave is staying inside me." Kissed her daughter's forehead, tears of joy flowing freely. Emma had not just survived the trial, she had transcended it. She had taken her trauma, faced it in the crucible of a courtroom, and emerged not just intact but transformed. As she left Emma's room, whispered a silent thank you to the universe, to fate, to whatever force had placed a gentle golden retriever in her daughter's life at exactly the moment when she needed him most. Justice, it turned out, sometimes wore golden fur and had warm, intelligent eyes that reflected unconditional love. Exactly 1 year after the verdict, Emma sat backstage at the Denver Convention Center, her small hand resting on Bailey's head as she waited to be introduced to an audience of 300 judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, psychologists, and child advocacy professionals. The National Child Advocacy Conference had invited her to speak about her experience, and Emma, now 8 years old, was surprisingly calm about the prospect. The transformation had been gradual but profound. The nightmares had faded by spring of that year. The hypervigilance had diminished as months of normalcy accumulated into genuine healing. Emma had returned to 2nd grade and actually enjoyed school again. She'd made new friends, played on the playground without fear, and reclaimed the joyful spontaneity that trauma had stolen from her. Bailey had remained constant throughout this journey, his presence becoming as essential to Emma's life as breathing. The dog had aged slightly, his face showing wisdom that went beyond his years. But his dedication to Emma remained absolute. When she had difficult days, and there were still some, Bailey knew instinctively, approaching her with a gentleness that transcended species. 5 minutes, the conference coordinator whispered, clipboard in hand. "Are you ready?" Emma nodded. She wore a simple pink dress and her hair was braided with ribbons. She looked every bit the 8-year-old girl she was, but there was something in her eyes, a clarity, a strength, that seemed far older. The introduction was warm and detailed. The audience heard about the hit and run, the trauma, the trial, and Bailey's pivotal role. They heard about Judge's commendation and the medical evidence supporting emotional support animals in courtroom settings. And then Emma was introduced. She walked onto the stage with Bailey beside her, the dog's leash held loosely in her small hand. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted almost 2 minutes. Emma waited patiently, her expression calm, until the applause faded. "Hi," she said into the microphone, her voice small but clear. "My name is Emma and I saw something bad happen. At first, nobody believed me because I was scared and confused. But then I got Bailey." She paused and Bailey looked up at her, his brown eyes reflecting the stage lights. "Bailey didn't make me remember things that weren't true. He just helped me not be so scared that I couldn't think. When I was holding Bailey, the scared part of my brain got smaller and the brave part got bigger." The audience was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. "I know there are other kids who've seen bad things like I did," Emma continued. "And I know some of them are scared to tell people because when you're scared, it's hard to talk. But if someone you love is there with you and there's something like Bailey that helps you feel safe, then you can be brave. And when you're brave, you can tell the truth." She looked directly at the audience. "The people in this room make decisions about kids like me. I want you to know that kids need help to be brave. We need people who love us and we need things that make us feel safe. If you help us feel safe, we can tell you the truth." Emma stepped back from the microphone, and the entire room erupted in applause. People stood, tears streaming down many faces. Several child psychologists were visibly crying. A prosecutor in the front row wiped his eyes with a tissue, shaking his head in wonder at the wisdom emerging from such a young voice. What happened in the following weeks exceeded anyone's expectations. Emma's speech was filmed and distributed to legal organizations across the country. Universities incorporated the case into their curriculum. Legal journals published articles analyzing the trial's significance. And most importantly, state legislatures began acting. Within 6 months, California passed the first formal statute recognizing emotional support animals as legitimate courtroom accommodations for child witnesses. Within a year, 12 additional states had followed suit. The precedent established by Judge's ruling became the foundation for systemic change that would protect hundreds of traumatized children in the years to come. Dr. Sarah Mitchell received a grant to expand her research on emotional support animals in trauma recovery. She trained other mental health professionals on Bailey's model of intervention. Within 2 years, her protocols had been adopted by 43 child advocacy centers across the country. Hearts of Courage, the facility where Emma had met Bailey, became nationally recognized as a model for emotional support animal training. Applications for their program tripled. Corinne Wright, the director, credited Emma publicly in every interview. Emma showed the world what we've always known, that animals and compassion can be powerful tools for healing and justice. But perhaps the most significant impact was on individual children. In cities and towns across America, traumatized child witnesses began receiving emotional support animals before testifying. In Phoenix, a 10-year-old boy named about witnessing a burglary with his German Shepherd mix beside him. In Miami, a 9-year-old girl named delivered testimony that convicted her abuser, her service dog providing the grounding she needed. In Chicago, a 7-year-old named James spoke about witnessing a shooting, his calm demeanor, supported by his emotional support cat, helping a jury see his credibility rather than his trauma. Each of these children carried Emma's legacy forward. Each one, in their own way, was Emma. In her, Emma had become something of a celebrity, though she remained refreshingly normal. She attended public school, played soccer, not very well, and loved to read books about animals. The only visible reminder of her extraordinary experience was Bailey, who accompanied her everywhere, to school, to birthday parties, to the grocery store. On the first anniversary of the trial's conclusion, the local courthouse held a small ceremony to dedicate a plaque in the hallway. It read, "In honor of Emma, whose courage and truth changed how our justice system protects child witnesses, and in gratitude to Bailey, whose unconditional support demonstrated the healing power of compassion." Emma, her parents, and Bailey attended the unveiling. She placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the plaque, and Bailey gently sniffed the flowers, his tail wagging slowly. Judge attended as well. She pulled Emma aside after the ceremony. "Emma, I want you to know something. In all my years on the bench, I've seen many trials, but I've never seen a case where truth was delivered with such clarity and courage. What you and Bailey didn't just convict one criminal, it changed the system. You made it better for everyone who comes after you." Emma, with the particular wisdom that traumatized children sometimes develop, simply nodded. "I just told the truth," she said. "Bailey helped me not be scared while I did it." That night, as Emma lay in bed with Bailey beside her, she thought about the other children she'd heard about through her parents, children in other states, other cities, other circumstances who had their own emotional support animals beside them in courtrooms. She wondered if they felt as peaceful as she did now, as safe, as understood. Her mother came in to tuck her in. "Are you thinking about something?" asked, smoothing her daughter's hair. "I'm thinking about how Bailey saved me," Emma said. "Not from the bad thing that happened. That still happened and I remember it. But Bailey saved me from being too scared to talk about it. He helped me be brave." Settled onto the edge of the bed, tears of gratitude flowing freely. "You were always brave, sweetheart. Bailey just helped you see it." Emma considered this. "Maybe, but I couldn't see it by myself. I needed help." "That's not a weakness, Emma. That's being human. We all need help sometimes." As left the room, Emma listened to the gentle sound of Bailey's breathing beside her. She thought about the trial, about harsh questions, about Judge's gentle voice, about the jury's careful deliberation. She thought about the man who had hit the bicycle and tried to escape, and how her courage had ensured he couldn't escape justice. But mostly, she thought about Bailey, and how a simple golden retriever had reminded her that she was never alone, that her truth mattered, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against fear is compassion. 2 years later, when Emma was 10 years old, she would return to that same convention center to speak at the National Child Advocacy Conference again. This time, Bailey would be certified as a therapy dog working with the organization, helping other traumatized children prepare for testimony. Emma would tell the audience that Bailey had become a symbol not just of her own healing, but of a new era in the American justice system, an era where children were protected, where science met compassion, and where truth was valued above all else. But for now, on this quiet night, Emma simply held her dog close and whispered words of gratitude to the universe for sending Bailey into her life when she needed him most. And Bailey, in his infinite wisdom and unconditional love, pressed his body against hers, a living reminder that sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is simply our presence, our faith, and our unwavering belief that the person beside us is brave enough to face the world. In that moment, in that bedroom, in that small house in a small city, the true miracle of Emma and Bailey's story was revealed. It was never about the trial, never about the verdict. It was about connection. It was about love. It was about two beings, one human, one animal, learning that together they could transform fear into courage, trauma into healing, and silence into truth. And that truth, once spoken, could change the world.